Alright guys, welcome to FW31 Setups for Idiots. Not calling you all idiots, but of course you're here because of your lack of knowledge. Not the most experienced guy in the paddock, but I'm pretty decent, and the purpose of this video is to try and get you guys up to my level in terms of information, and then you can seek out your own perspective on the information elsewhere, verify, and so on, to then, help your testing and whatever you do in the future. So I'm going to pull up the setup screen here, and what I'm going to do is basically explain the setup from different perspectives. Aerodynamics is king in the F1 car, the real one, and especially this one in the sim. So nearly everything you do in the setup has an aerodynamic side of it, but I'm going to try and keep things simple and explain the different settings in terms of feel and balance. So, and then at the same time try and explain the aerodynamic counterpart to what these changes might affect. So I'll go through tires, aero, the chassis settings, a bit of the dampers, and of course all the stuff in the drive engine and so on as well. Alright, so we'll start off with tire pressures. Basically iRacing explains it as lower pressure equals more heat buildup, better grip at lower loads, higher pressure equals less heat, better grip at higher loads. But in terms of balance, this means that in high-speed corners, you will get, because you're leading onto something versus something that's giving more give, you have better balance overall in medium and high-speed corners, but you lose grip, of course, so you're not going to be able to throttle up in slow-speed corners as well. And the other side, with the lower end tire pressures, you get more grip in the slow speed corners, but the car is going to be leaning more over on the tire. The tire is moving around a fair bit more with the softer tire pressures. So, and as a result, it will create more heat because you're working the tires more than with a stiffer pressure. So, the different tracks you go to, they might require different balance and priorities. If there's a track with a lot of slow speed corners, you might want to focus more towards the lower end to get that grip. But, other stuff in the setup plays a role, so you have to put that into consideration. So you want to be fluid with your temperature manipulations, because, for example, if you go higher camber, you may want to go lower on the tire temperatures, to get the temperature range you want and the balance. But that's all experimental stuff, that people can fool around with to try and get better speed and so on. But in terms of overall balance, you either start at the very minimum, go up until it's balanced enough in the medium and high speed corners, or you can start from the higher end and then go creep down with the tire temperature information. You can also look at the tire temps in a sim. After the recent update, it's much more accurate for your inner and outer tire temperatures. So it's not too much of an issue with reading off the information in the sim and making tire pressure adjustments and camber adjustments to put yourself in a comfortable range in terms of balance. So so adjusting your tire temperature from torsion bar rate and camber level information is a pretty good way to go about it as well. How high you go on the torsion bar rate or the camber, can dictate, how much you use the tire in different areas. So you kind of have to make changes to the tire temperatures to fit that and complement the other settings as well. And of course, the same thing is true the other way around, where if you absolutely need to run a specific range of tire temperature, then there's only so much you can do with the other settings, because they'll work the tires either more or less than you may want or not want. So you'll have to make adjustments and compromises elsewhere in the setup. Alright, moving on to the aerodynamics. Here in the setup you'll see the aerodynamic package, or aero package, sorry. Basically downforce trim, your base front flap, your flap adjuster dial, total front flap levels, and rear wing wicker. And just below it you have the aero calculator. Just before I go through the aero package, just a quick note that the aero calculator is basically just that, a calculator. It doesn't do anything in a sim, doesn't control anything at all. and the note here says it itself that the section is for calculation purposes only. You use the flap, wicker, and the above stuff to figure out the aerodynamic balance, so that is true. So basically, for example, the front right height in this setup is 25.0, the rear is at 46.0 millimeters. You set this in the calculator and it shows you your front downforce levels. Currently it's at 45.85. So if, for example, I wanted more downforce to the rear and less to the front, I went up on the rear wicker here, for example, you'll see the aerodynamic balance change because once you set the ride height, once you make the change to the aero package, it'll show you a reflection of that change here as well. Other things you do in this setup changes the ride height minutely, but that's something we'll cover a bit later as well, and as well as an overview of the overall aerodynamics of in the car. So to get started here with the aerodynamics package, basically the choices are low, medium, and high downforce. The difference in low and high downforce, low, medium, and high, I should say, in an F1 car is basically how much bits they add to the car to increase downforce. So if they go to Monaco, for example, they'll add a lot of different bits and stuff as much as legally possible to increase the downforce. And if they were to go to Monza, for example, they basically clean up the car and remove all these other stuff, because every little bump and curve on the car makes a big difference in terms of the aerodynamics. So they will not have that much wing and stuff added to the car as a result, and then the sim is basically simplified. Instead of having the direct wing adjustments, the base wing adjustments, this is what we have. So the low downforce trim level might be a lower front wing, a lower rear wing, or I should say maybe more a lower rear wing, because we have a decent amount of control over the front wing and the front downforce levels. So it may just be a lower rear wing, and then we can control the wicker levels. Technically, I can't really explain what a wicker is, but it's basically fine-tuning the aerodynamic balance of the rear wing or so on. So you add a wicker, and it adds overall downforce to the rear end. So you increase the downforce to the rear, it's less downforce to the front. So you go up on the wicker and it adds more downforce or downforce balance to the rear as well. But because you started with low, there's a limit to how much you can get. So it's a difference of 5 in millimeters using metric here. So minus 10 millimeter difference from the base level to a plus millimeter difference overall. And when you switch to medium downforce, it's pretty much slightly more degrees on the rear wing. It's the same difference range in terms of changes you can make to the wicker, of course, on the aerodynamic balance with the front flap adjustment as well. But the main difference is that you have more downforce versus low, basically a higher rear wing angle than you did with low, and the same applies to high. So you have a much bigger rear wing with high downforce, and then you control your you fine-tune your downforce level with the wicker. So high downforce with minus 10 is going to be close to medium downforce with plus 10. But there is a gap in between the two, because there's only so much you can do to increase the downforce or the downforce balance, especially in the rear, when you've reduced the rear wing, using the rear wing as a proper example. The way it's simplified in the sim, you have to look at it this way, because in real life they'll have the exact wing angles, they'll have little bits on the wings, and they'll be running different angles. So it's much more dynamic. So you can imagine 2-3 screens of setups all about the different downforce levels on the different parts of the car. So the main thing they can control in terms of adjusting the downforce in a big way in the front is the base front flap and the flap adjuster dial. So the base front flap, the base wing level in the front, I suspect, and then the flap adjuster dial is basically the flap is adjustable. There's a lot more dynamic stuff added to the front wing, but that isn't simulated in the sim to my knowledge. So we basically have the base and the adjuster to work with. So the base flap level and the flap adjuster dial combined gives us the total front flap that we can set on the front wing. Our maximum in the sim is set to 30.00. This is a limit iRacing has set for whatever reason. So once you reach that limit, any change you make to the base or the adjuster going up on it won't change the aerodynamic level in the front. So only when you go lower than this limit in terms of the changes to the base and the adjuster will it make a change to your aerodynamics. So you'll see once I go lower on the base flap here, base flap has changed to 29.5. The base flap adjustment goes in 0.25 increments. You'll see the front downforce level change as well once I go down on the base front flap, basically reducing the front downforce by reducing the wing angle on the front wing. So with that said, adjusting the flap adjuster to go back up on the aerodynamic balance to reach the total flap level, it just creates that balance between the base and front flap and the flap adjuster dial. Now this is a somewhat debated point, whether or not running less flap and more on the base level gives you a better or different aerodynamic balance. I'm not 100% sure of. It's something to experiment with, but you'll have to probably rely more on data because you won't be able to feel it as much because the downforce level is basically the same. The total flap you're running is the same, but you're just running more on the base and just more flap basically. So I'm not sure if it makes a big difference, but it may make a difference in terms of balance or how the front wing acts. Maybe it does a higher base does more work on initial entry, the flap does more work on the second phase of entry or the first phase of exit, and as a result the balance is going to be a little bit better on initial entry with more base or something. I don't know, that's just a little theory, but either way, you set the downforce level, you always want to try and initially get the total flap amount you can get away with, because it'll be every track you go to, the downforce level is you want to run as much as you can in different areas. So certain tracks like this track here, Road America, which you're seeing in the background, is a little bit picky with the downforce level in the front end and the middle off of the corner, where you might want to run less than the maximum to get an aerodynamic balance that you like. So for example, running -10 here at Road America, 25.0 gets me to the total 30-degree front flap amount of 47.1 on the front downforce level. If I go down to 24, you see the front downforce is to 46.75. So 46.75 might give me the balance that I need for this track specifically, to get out of some of the corners comfortably and without too much downforce in the middle off of the corner on the front end itself. So there is a point of having too much front downforce, and there's things you can do elsewhere in the setup to help this, but there's a limit to what you can do elsewhere, and then you might want to come back to the aerodynamic package and make a change to better your balance overall. Alright, so moving on to the chassis. Did a decent overview of the aerodynamics, and now we'll cover a bit of the mechanical. So I'll basically give a quick run through of the different settings here and how they affect the car in terms of feel first, because that's a simple way to explain it to drivers. We're all drivers initially in iRacing coming into this car, and then we have to increase our knowledge and become more of a engineer at the same time. So it can be troubling and it can be frustrating, but you have to translate that feel to information of knowing exactly what the car is doing in different areas of the corner, and then translate that back in terms of feel, because as a driver you need to have something that is comfortable underneath you that you can push the car to the limit. So it's a very tough dynamic in this car to be a driver slash engineer at the same time, questioning every little thing in the car, making a lot of changes and going out there and trying to push to the limit with a very different setup and changing stuff on a constant basis. Alright, so we'll start here with the front, the anti-roll bar and the heave rate in the front and the rear because they do the same thing. I'll speak about the anti-roll bar balance, the heave rate, as well as the aerodynamic side to the feel and the balance of the settings. So basically the anti-roll bar is just that, an anti-roll bar. It's the higher you go on the setting, it reduces the roll in the car from side to side. The heave rate in the front and the rear is the same. It's up and down movement of the car. So you can imagine that as much as important as the aerodynamics is in the car, controlling the up and down movement of the front and the rear is very significant. So the ride height being 25.0 for example, with a soft heave rate means that it's moving up and down a bit more. So softer equals more movement, stiffer equals less movement, and this is going to be repeated in a lot of different settings in this F1 car, more so when we get to the dampers. But basically the softer the more movement, the stiffer the less movement. So for example 30, there's still some movement in the front, but it's relatively controlled. And 60, there's as little movement as possible because it's the max setting you can set. There's still some movement, but it's just so little that it's negligible as well. So this, as the heave rate is to up and down movement, the anti-roll bar is to side-by-side movement. In terms of balance, the anti-roll bar, the stiffer you go on it, you'll feel initial entry on the steer, a little on the steer on the exit, and a bit more oversteer in the middle of the corner. At the lower end you'll feel it's relatively neutral on entry, but when you get in the middle of the corners when you'll significantly feel the different balance, and it's rotating more, so you'll either feel much more oversteer on the first phase of entry, or I should say the second phase of entry. So it's once you're really getting into the corner and it's already rolled over, you'll feel the balance with the softer anti-roll bar, and they'll either over-rotate in the middle of the corner. That's when you know you have too little on the anti-roll bar setting itself. Alright, so the lower end anti-roll bar, in terms of aerodynamics, the softer it is, it leans also over a bit more. Everything you do with in an F1 car, the base of the car has an opposite effect in terms of movement. So with the anti-roll bar, it leans over more to the left. That means the right hand side of the chassis, the car is higher in the air. So it's more downforce on the left hand side of the car and less on the right from it rolling over as much as it can. So you go higher in the setting, let's say to the maximum, and there's very little movement side to side in the car. So you go into the corner and the rotation over, let's say going to left-hander, on the left side is very minimal on entry, and it maintains that through the middle of the corner and off the corner as well. So in terms of the aerodynamics, it's less downforce on initial entry, but it's maintaining the downforce level in the front with the front left and the on the right front and the left front, sorry. So it's the downforce level shifts, it changes, but the difference between this 5 and 60 in terms of the front right hand in the middle of the corner, or the downforce level in the front in the middle of the corner, is very similar, although because 5 is leaning over a fair bit more, the aerodynamic balance is different. So it's working more in a different area, and as a result it might cause some issues versus 60, where it's maintaining a smooth right head balance in the front, going through the corner in terms of lean. So it's maintaining a close to static balance in the front end with the right height. But remember, this is for left and right movement in terms of it rolling over, mainly in the front. The same applies to the rear, but less so, because the front is so significant, because the aerodynamic balance for the F1 car is more to the front. The front anti-roll bar setting is much more sensitive overall than the rear would. So the rear is the minimum is 10 millimeters, the maximum is 30. You'll feel the effect a little bit differently. You'll feel it mainly in the middle off of the corner, even though it works the same way, by preventing the rear from rolling over as much the higher you go with it, maintaining that that ride height level in the middle of the corner to whatever ride height you set. And as a result, so let's say for example 46.0 millimeters on the ride height. Enter the corner. Depending on what my heave rate is, when I get on the brakes and the weight of the car shifts forward, the back end goes up into the air a little bit. So it shifts from 46.0 to either 46 point something or maybe even 47. It depends on how soft you have your heave rate and whether the balance elsewhere, but I'll get to that later. So once you're getting off the brakes, you're entering the corner, for example, and you're starting to get back onto the gas, that ride height is going to try to go lower than 46.0, or if it's still higher than 46 when you're still easing off of the brake and coasting, then it starts to go lower. However, the stiffer the anti-roll bar means that if you're going through a left-hander again and you're about to accelerate, it's not going to, the back left is not going to lean down as much. So you would have gotten a little bit more grip on the left rear because of this, and it would translate to an overall feeling of a little bit extra balance coming off the corner. But with the stiffer rear anti-roll bar, it's keeping it at that right height level uniformly to the left rear and the right rear, so you'll feel less grip, because the rear ride height is not dipping down as much as it would. There's always an asymmetric balance in the F1 car, but usually it's best to build a symmetric setup and then fine-tune once your setup is sorted to the asymmetric, because it can get very complicated and little things can go a long way. So hopefully I didn't lose you with the rear anti-roll bar explanation there, but basically the main thing you should remember is that it's left to right movement, side to side with the anti-roll bar, and the heave rate is up and down. So going to further explanation on the heave rate purely governs up and down movement, so it has a closer relationship to the aerodynamics of the setup than the anti-roll bar, for example, and some other stuff. So because it directly affects the up and down movement, it changes the aerodynamics in every way that it moves in the different types of the corner. So the minimum on the front is 20 with a maximum of 60 Newton millimeters. The rear end is a minimum of 200 with a maximum of 400. So just as I said, it controls up and down movement of the F1 car. You enter in a heavy braking zone, you get onto the brakes. Whatever you set the front heave rate to and the rear heave rate to dictates how much the balance of the car shifts. So the softer the front heave rate, the more the front end of the car dips down from the weight shifting forward on the brakes, and the softer the rear heave rate, the higher in the air the back end comes up from getting harder on the brakes as well. As I touched on before a bit, every shift you make to the base of the car, just picture the base of the car, the floor of the car itself. It's rigid. So when you get on the brakes, if the front dips down for whatever reason, the back end will automatically come up. However, if for example you run a very stiff rear heave rate and a very soft front heave rate, the front end is going to dip down less, because the rear end is not moving up as much. It's stiffer. It's going to restrict it from the back end from coming up as much under heavy braking. However, because of this, it's at the same time restricting the front end from moving down as much. So if you run a really soft front heave, yes, it's moving down to a similar level than you would with soft rear heave, but it's not as significant a difference. Alright, so getting further into the heave rate, things are going to start getting a little bit complicated because it's a one-to-one relationship with the aerodynamics. So let me shift the aerodynamic balance here. It's 30.0 on the front flap. The front downforce level is at 45.85 with a 25 front ride height and a 46.0 rear. Wick rear in the rear is at -10. So the front downforce level 45.85. Now this is significant to the front heave rate and the rear as well, as I've just touched on, is that if it's a very soft heave rate in the front, the moment I get onto the brakes, the moment you hit the brakes, the weight of the car shifts forward. So on the soft heave rate, because it's soft and it's more movement, overall is more compression, the front end of the car is getting lower to the ground. So it's going lower than 25.0 millimeters. So for example, let's say, just for example, the exact amount is probably, like point something. But for example, let's go one click down to 24.0. You see the downforce level shifted from 25.85 to 26.06. So on the brakes, you can say that the softer the heave rate and the more movement of the front end closer to the ground, the higher the downforce in the front end of the car, and as a result, the less downforce on the rear end of the car, because the same is true. So how much the heave rate moves around, there's a relationship with the front and the rear. It's up to you, because this is basically your setup. How you set it is how you want it to work, and in what areas of the corner. Now, this is the aerodynamic side of it. Now I'll explain it in terms of balance. So a very soft heave rate on entering the corner, as I mentioned before, once you get onto the brakes, the shifting forward, you'll feel more downforce. So on your initial entry to the corner, it's going to feel like, great. It's turning into the corner. It feels like it's turning in like Superman, and it's flying into the corner, fairly well. So for example, on the entry to the corner, I'm going to separate it into entry, middle, and exit. So the entry to the corner with the heave rate, so it's very soft. You get onto the brakes. Any changes you make, and I'll separate the different stages of the corner as well. So you're on the gas, the front, the weight of the car is probably going to be close to neutral, but shifted more towards the rear end of the car. So that means the back end is compressing into the ground a little bit, and the front end as a result is coming up just a little bit as well. This is dictated with the heave rate as well, but I'll go into further details of that later. But because of this, the moment you get onto the brakes, it shifts the weight forward, so the front end is dipping down, the back end is coming up a bit. When you're coming off of the brakes and you're rolling the car, it's still shifted forward, but a lot less than when you are on the brakes. So it's less aggressive, but it's still decelerating. So the front end is still shifted forward just a little bit. However, once you start getting, the moment you start getting back onto the gas, the balance shifts towards the rear. The rear end starts going down, and as a result, the front end is coming up a bit. So initial throttle application is extremely important in this car, because if you're too easy with it, you're not accelerating as quickly, and the aerodynamics is not coming back into the play as quickly. So the car will still be moving around as much, because the back end of the car is still up in the air. So as less grip you have in the rear from being hard on the brakes and rolling the car, if you start easing into the throttle, the back end is not compressing as much, so you have less grip in the rear. It kind of overrides your mechanical grip with the balance of the car, because the back end is so high in the air. It's not giving the tires any form of compression to make it work more, or to complement the mechanical side of the setup. So if you're a bit, let's say for example, you're a bit aggressive on initial throttle application, and you start speeding up fairly quickly, the back end starts compressing right away, and at the front end is moving up just a little bit. So once as I just explained the different parts of the corner, entry, middle, and exit, you basically on the brakes on an entry, going into heavy braking zone for example, you're maybe rolling through the middle a little bit, and then you're throttle up on exit. So it's shifted down the aerodynamic balance to the front of the car, and then it's shifted more towards the rear on exit, mainly because you're exiting off the corner with throttle application. Alright, so in terms of balance and the way you set this up, because it's the front heave rate and the rear heave rate, they hopefully I've explained properly enough what they do and where. So it's a matter of how much the front end goes down, the softer you with the front, and mainly in terms of how much the rear end goes up, the softer you run the rear. There's a balance between the front and the rear. It just depends on how much you want which end of the car to do the most work in the different areas, and so on. But as said, in terms of balance, because the moment you get onto the brakes or the moment you get off the gas, because the balance balance is, the weight I should say, is shifted forward a little bit, and all this stuff is happening extremely quickly in an F1 car. It's already stiff to begin with, so any weight transfer is happening right away. So the moment you start easing off of the gas, it's becoming more neutral. The moment you're off the gas completely, it's starting to coast. So it's neutral towards, shifting forward. The moment you touch the brakes, it's shifting forward, and the moment you're getting off the brakes, it's shifting back up. So all of this is happening actively at the same time, constantly. So setting up the car, for the balance in these different areas can get complicated and time consuming, and then you have to put on top of that your driving style, what you prefer. And basically your driving style and what you prefer, it's a matter of how much aerodynamic balance you want in the different areas of the corner. Some people might prefer on the steer on entry, but more turn in the middle off of the corner. And as a result, that means they'll want, a higher anti-roll bar or something, because that'll give them the turn in the middle of the corner, off of the corner, with a little bit of on the steer on entry, and so on. And then they find a way to incorporate that into the setup to, to work well with what they prefer in terms of balance. People like me, where I prefer the car to do as much of the work as possible, would usually run towards the low end of the heave rate in the front, and so with the rear. So the moment I get onto the brakes, or the moment I start slowing down to enter a high-speed corner or medium-speed corner or whatever, the downforce is shifted so much to the front that I just need to turn the wheel just a tiny bit, and it's already doing a fair amount of work, because it's a lot of downforce in the front, so it's turning more. So it's all a matter of fine-tuning and working a balance in between the two. But as I mentioned before, aerodynamics is king in this car. So if you looked at it a different way and you concentrated more on the mechanical side and you ignored the aerodynamic side of things, you would have suffered greatly in different places. Some places you would get away with it, where the aerodynamics isn't playing a huge role, but it complements the mechanical so much. You put the high end up in the air, the front end won't, the car won't slow down as efficiently, and so on as well. And you put the back end up in the air, you're getting onto the gas. Whatever mechanical grip you had before, you'd lose, most of it, because there's no compression on the back end of the car, and so on as well. So I'm trying to explain this overall, but aerodynamics overall plays such a big role that you need to kind of focus on the settings that affect it in the most, to find an aerodynamic balance that's comfortable for you for the specific track, and then you kind of build some mechanical balance into the setup while keeping in mind what the aerodynamics is doing and how it's affecting the car overall. Alright, so to go into further detail of the heave rate from the front to the rear. So let's say you run a stiff front, so that means the front end isn't compressing as much on initial braking. However, if you run a stiff rear as well, it means that there's extremely minimal movement from the base of the car, and as I said before, to picture a plank. So if both ends is pretty stiff, and I'll go up to 400 on the rear heave, for example, you get onto the brakes, there's very minimal movement to the front dipping down, and very minimal movement for the rear end coming up into the air. So the aerodynamic balance shift in the car is going to stay relatively neutral. So for example, if your ride height is 25.0 and you're running stiff heave rates in the front, once you get onto the brakes, the front end isn't going to dip down as much. It's probably going to be 0.1 or something, or even a fraction of that. I don't know exactly how much the shifts are with the different heave rate settings. And the same equates to the rear. So if you're running 47.3, the back end won't probably move up as much, a fraction, if not as I said before, the 0.1. So it's just a matter of finding the balance there. However, in terms of aerodynamics and balance, what this does, because it's not shifting forward, it means you have less downforce on the entry to the corner, so it immediately becomes on the steer, and that on the steer is the same to the rear. However, going through the middle of the corner, that ride head is close to static. It's not moving around as much as the softer heave rate settings. So the ride head is going to be pretty much close to that, 25.0 going through the middle of the corner, and the 47.3 and the rear end. So now it's a question of 25.0 in the front ride height and 47.3 in the rear. Does that give me a good balance for the car to turn through the middle of the corner very well? And does it give me a balance on throttle application where I'm still getting a good amount of mechanical grip in the rear end on throttle application? This is extremely important because the stiffer you make the heave rates, the more the focus shifts over to the mechanical side of the setup, because it's not changing the ride height as dynamically as you would with running a soft heave rate in the front and the rear. So just to explain the opposite side of things, with a softer front heave and a softer rear heave going into that same corner, you get onto the brakes, it shifts the downforce so much to the front, and the moment you start getting off of the brakes, it starts shifting back, and then the moment you get onto the gas, it's shifting more towards the rear again, but a lot more. So the ride height changes from the entry to the middle and the exit of the corner is very different and is very dynamic. So if it feels great on entry, that means you have a lot of downforce on entry and it feels great. Or if the middle off of the corner it feels terrible, and you're just understeering off, that means the front end is coming up so much. Once you get onto the gas and it's just further back, the back end is compressing, the front end is coming higher in the air, so the downforce in the front end is a lot less. So with the heave rates, it's pretty much controlling your aerodynamic balance on entry, middle, and exit to whatever you prefer. And once I go through all the other things, the picture of how things work together and how each setting complements each other is going to come into play more than anything else. Alright, so things should get less complicated going forward now because I've covered the heave rate a bit. I'll touch on the overall balance, and again it'll get more complicated once it gets to the dampers, but for now let's go more towards the mechanical settings and talk about the mechanical balance from the torsion bar rate to the camber and a little bit of the toe and so on as well. Alright, so we'll get started here with the torsion bar rate. So the torsion bar rate, in terms of balance and feel, the higher you go on the setting, the maximum being 150 Newton millimeters, the minimum being 50 Newton millimeters. So the higher you go, the more understeer you feel on entry, the more oversteer in the middle of the corners, and the more understeer on the exit of the corner as well. So the softer being towards 50, and the stiffer being more towards 150, the maximum range. In terms of aerodynamics, I would say it plays a similar role to what the heave rate does, because the stiffer, it keeps it a little bit higher in the air on entry, and it probably maintains a more consistent front downforce level, or front ride height level I should say. Through the middle of the corner, that increases the oversteer in the middle of the corner, but then it's the same consistent level of ride height as on entry as on exit. So it's that's produces the feel of understeer, oversteer, understeer, because once you go into the middle of the corner, it's not leaning over as much, and the downforce level is relatively consistent to whatever you had it previously set. So if you went up on the front ride height, or lower front wing in the front, downforce level in the middle of the corner will be reduced a bit, and as a result it'll be less oversteer. So for example, 150 with for example 29 on the total front flap, the balance, in terms of balance, you'll have less aerodynamics working in the front. In terms of balance in the middle of the corner, the middle of the corner is going to feel better. It's not too oversteer with 150. However, instead of the front wing, we usually use the front inert mass setting to balance out the torsion bar rate. So just as the torsion bar rate is understeer on entry, oversteer in the middle of the corner, and understeer on exit, the front inert mass is oversteer on entry, understeer in the middle, and oversteer on exit. So the higher you go on it, the more of that understeer you feel in the center of the corner. However, because it's compensating directly to the torsion bar rate's effect, you'll feel it kind of cancel it out a little bit. So suddenly 150, with the maximum on the front inert mass like 40, suddenly 150 won't feel as understeer on entry, and the oversteer in the middle of the corner won't be overbearing, and the understeer and exit is going to feel just as good as the entry is. Now in terms of aerodynamics, I have no idea exactly what the front inert mass does and how it affects the aerodynamics. My knowledge so far is that it deals with tire oscillation and other stuff, but I figure, it's just another damper, so just another, this might be the stiffest setting and the lower might be softer or something. So I'm not exactly sure how it works, but that's the effect in terms of feel and balance of how it works and how it interacts with the torsion bar rate itself. So, from 50 on the torsion bar rate, for example, is more oversteer on entry, understeer in the middle of the corner, and then oversteer on exit, because it's full soft. The moment you start entering the corner, it's compressing down a bit more, reducing the front ride height, thus increasing the aerodynamics balance on the front. But then when you get to the middle of the corner, it's already shifting over to the anti-roll bars domain, whatever you have it set to complement the torsion bar rate in the middle of the corner. But the aerodynamic balance is already shifted, so the right-hand side of the car is a little bit higher in the air. I suspect with the torsion bar rate, it still has an asymmetric balance about it in the middle of the corners, unlike the stiffer setting. So it's kind of works. So well, I guess it's funny because it's kind of like the anti-roll bar and the heave rate together, because it does dictate, how high in the air the car is, in the different areas of the corner. In the front, not to a huge significant amount, but it does play a role. Because the stiffer is moving around a lot less, and at the same time there is a roll to it that is similar to the anti-roll bar, and because the soft is rolling over much more, so the left-hand side going into a right-hander, for example, is going to be closer to the ground than the right-hand side, so the aerodynamic balance is going to be a fair bit different. So whether or not that's what is producing the understeer in the middle of the corner, I'm not 100% sure, but what I do know is that the moment you go up one click to 60, the balance shifts. So instead of producing understeer in the middle of the corner that 50 does, 60 doesn't do that. It starts, the chain of oversteer in the middle of the corner from the lower end, and then you go up to 70 plus, and the oversteer in the middle of the corner increases, and the understeer on entry increases as well. So it's just a matter of balancing these stuff. So you go to a track, you find a comfortable level, for the track to begin with, and then you can balance out the other stuff. Towards the end of this, I'll go over the balance and a process you can go through to building a setup to try and help simplify things initially. But now I'm just going through the individual settings to explain it to the best of my ability. Again, my knowledge might be lacking, you might know more than me, but this is an idiot's guide, so I have my excuse. Alright, so moving on to the camber levels. As most of you would already know, changing the camber levels will dictate your contact patch. The more contact patch you use, the more grip overall, because it's more the mechanical side of the setup. Mechanical sides of the setup is mainly adjustments you make that, it's like a direct correlation to what the tire does relatively. So, increasing the camber is pretty much the main suspect, so to speak. The higher you go in the camber, it reduces the contact patch, but it increases, as iRacing says here, inward negative or outward positive lean of the wheel. More lean equals cornering force and direction of lean, more wear and heat, less braking capability. So the higher you go and the more you reduce the contact patch, your braking efficiency goes down naturally. However, it increases the heat of the tire on the inside because it's using more of the inside area, more of the very inside and in the middle of the tire most of the time, depending on the circuit. However, if you're going through a medium and a high-speed corner and it leans over, it starts using more of the right-hand side. But if you're too low on the cambers, it'll use, it might use the contact patch is going to increase to where if this was the tire, for example, it'll use pretty much the middle of the tire, and that's not efficient in terms of speed. So you might, in terms of feel, you might, the lower the camber is going to feel like understeer. The higher the camber is going to feel more towards the oversteer end. and in the high-speed corners it's more a matter of it leans over and it kind of dictates the level of rotation to the middle of the corner relatively. But you want to use, increase the contact patch as much as possible, but more towards the interior and middle, but with a good temperature split between the inner and the outside tire temperature range. Most people aim for around a 10-degree difference, which is okay, but some people would compromise the temperature and contact patch efficiency of the tire through the cambers to just be able to run higher cambers and thus gain a tenth or two in a specific corner elsewhere or something. So Silverstone, for example, someone might run a lot higher camber than usual and just sacrifice the increased tire wear and tire temperature just to make sure they're gaining as much speed as possible. However, the downside is, if we really had proper tire wear this season, is that the tires would go away quicker than everybody else. And someone else is using the tire more efficiently is going to be able to maintain the pace better than them. But it's kind of hard to explain the cambers fully in terms of balance, but as I mentioned, it's more of a steer the higher you go with it. It's a matter of feel as well, and because you can, once you go up on the anti-roll bar and you go up on the camber, for example, it's not going to roll over as much in the middle of the corner. So, if it's not rolling over as much, it's not, using the middle and the outer part of the tire as much. So it's going to focus more towards the inner and the middle part of the tire as well. So that plays a role. So for example, anti-roll bar would be one of the settings where it kind of has a close relationship with your tire temperatures, because it dictates of how much you use the tire in different parts of the corner. So with the rear cambers, basically just as the front you might use to dictate how much turn you want through some corners, the rear is more leaning towards grip on throttle application. So the more contact patch you use in the rear, thus the more grip, so you would usually either go lower on the rear cambers to get off the corners better. However, the other side to it is that on entries to middle and high speed corners, the back end is either going to roll over a bit more. It's the same effect like the front. Of course, you'll feel it more in the front than the rear, but the rear it's the same effect, and it can be troublesome entering a corner and the back end is rolling over, and especially on the initial exit, where it's throttling up and it's moving a bit, and if the back end is rolling over because it's giving grip in a straight line on throttle application, however the lateral force is moving around a fair bit more. So similar to the feel of running a tire pressure that is too low, where the tire is moving around a bit, it's a similar feel when you're running too low or camber. But any form of movement, you want to play around with the camber and figure out where that balance is coming from, or whatever detrimental balance you might have in different parts of the corners. Alright, so moving on to the ride heights, and usually described as the rake level in a car. Usually want to run the front end as low as possible, because as mentioned before with the aerodynamics, the lower the front end is to the ground, the more downforce shift to the front, and as a result more turn and aerodynamic efficiency in the front. However, as mentioned before as well, you can have too much downforce in the front, but you can use stuff like the heave to fine-tune the downforce levels in the different parts of the corners and so on. But the main part with the rake levels that you use to adjust is pretty much your base aerodynamic level, or the aerodynamic balance that it overall is more comfortable for you. All the other stuff is like fine-tuning it, the heave rate stuff that I talked about before. It changes, but the base level, it changes what the base level is fundamentally. So if, for example, you're running very high rake, it'll kind of force you to run either a stiffer heave to not have the car move around as much, because your rake levels in different parts of the corner might be too much. So if you get onto the brakes and the back end, you touch the wheel and the back end is like flipping around on you, then it means your ride height on entry in the rear end was probably a bit too high, so the downforce shift to the front was a lot more, and as a result the the moment you it got onto the brakes and it shifted forward, and you started turning, the downforce was like so much downforce to the front that it just overpowered anything in the rear end, and you lost the car naturally. So either set the rake level, which is basically the balance between the front and the rear ride height, to a comfortable range, and then fine tune with the heave rate and stuff to the different parts of the corner to get you what you want. So usually that's one of the first things people set on track, like a good range. But with high downforce, I'm going to go through some vague ranges of rake levels just to give an idea of the aerodynamic balance, just to give people a good example. So high downforce, for example, plus 10 on the wicker. Let's see, ride height at 25.0 in the front and 51 in the rear. The downforce to the front end is, from the calculator, see, is 45.33. However, shift down on the rake levels or the wicker levels, down one click, you see increase the front downforce as well. Go down to 0, it increases a bit more. Same, so you go down to minus 10, and the downforce shift to the front is there's nearly a full % there. So one thing you can do right away is you go down on the rear ride height. So from 51 we'll go down to 58.0. Rebalance the front, go back down on the rear front ride height, make sure it's solid. So 48.0. So you look at the error calculator, 46.6, but this was minus 10 with the rear ride height at 51. Now we'll go down to 48. And you see it's the actual front downforce balance is 46.1. So just to further give an example, let's shift it back up. So up to plus 10 on the wicker, and then back up to 51
User joined
on
your channel.
The ride height, and you'll see that is 45.3. So that's the difference with the front downforce balance once you set the rake level. So now that you know that, let's say for example with minus 10 and 48, that produced the 46 point whatever range, that's what you want in terms of front downforce level. You just increase the rear ride height. Instead of increasing it here, I'll increase it here to show you the 52, 53, 54, 55, 56, and that got you to where you to a similar front downforce level of the previous setting with the lower wicker. Alright, so let's talk about the ballast up here and the braking a little bit. The ballast, the lower you go with the ballast, the more understeer it is on entry in terms of balance and feel, and more oversteer on the exit of the corner. The higher you go to the on the balance, the more oversteer it is on entry, but the more understeer on exit. So as a result, pretty much everyone has been running in a more positive range of the ballast, the maximum being 150. A lot of people will run 150 everywhere and just build the rest of the setup around it to find a comfortable range that they would like. They are limiting themselves relatively, but at the end of the day, with how the sim puts things together, running the higher end, you're not really going to lose that much. But I'm usually around 40 because it's not too much or too little of each of the effect, and the weight balance range usually around 48.8 to 49.0. It's usually fairly comfortable. The technical side of this is, the balance is basically weight that is shifted from the car from either more forward or more rearward. So in real life, they basically have to move a big block of lead or something to transfer the weight around. But in the sim, this is just a simple explanation of the feel of it. And once you experiment, you'll get a much better idea of how the changes feel, and then you can adjust to what is good for you, and so on. Now to touch on braking as well, I usually run high or medium brake pressure, but it's up to you and what your equipment can run comfortably or whatever. So I have the Club Sport pedals, so I have a decent amount of control over my throttle brake application. How much pressure I put in is pretty much how I get in turn. So you can be very consistent with the pressure, although if you have G25s or whatever, then it's pretty much more about the distance you press it because it's so easy. So as a result, you can probably get away with running high better than me, but it depends on the overall balance. So basically in an F1 car, you'll use the brakes to slow the car down. And going into the heavy braking zones, you want to figure out, how much you can slow the car down and how little a distance is possible. So you would go out there, experiment with the different brake pressures, and with the different brake biases as well. So if you go up to, let's say, 58.0, and you lock up the brakes immediately, you go down to 57, and you don't lock up the brake, so you go back up again to 57.5, and if you start locking up again, then 57.0 is a good comfortable range for you to slow the car down to the best of your ability in the heavy braking zones with your brake pressure and that specific brake bias. To change the brake pressure, the way you apply the brake might be a little bit different, so you might be able to get away with more or less. It depends on what you like. So the brake bias balance is different. So going into high-speed corners, if it's more rearward, you'll be able to enter the corner better. If it's more forward, you get onto the brakes, you'll get some understeer, so it's detrimental to the entry of the corner in like a high-speed corner or something. But in a heavy braking zone, you want it as forward as possible, because that's the most effective way to slow the car down, the front end doing most of the work. And because most of the downforce is on the front end, you really want the front end to help slow the car down more than the rear itself. Alright, so in the sim we have the base brake bias and the peak brake bias. So the base brake bias is basically what is going to be set at the moment you touch the brakes, and the peak is basically what is going to be at 100% of brake application. The brake bias ramping is the percentage of where it starts ramping from the base to the peak brake bias setting. So if, for example, from experimentations, I know that 55.5 is, the rear tires are locking up, then I'll go up on it a bit, and if I know 56.0 is bare minimum I can get away with, then that'll be my brake bias. And I know, for example, 57.0 is the most I can get away with in the heavy braking zone, so that'll be the peak. So I'll set the ramping to whatever I like, but technically, let's say Silverstone going into turn 7, you would want the bias to be as rearward as possible, so you can enter that high-speed corner comfortably and not understeer from having a too forward bias. Funny enough, as a result, so if I set the ramping to 40 and I get into the brakes at like 30-something% going into that corner, it's going to be fine. Or if I go above that 40-something%, it's going to start ramping. So instead of being 56.0, it's going to start ramping up to 56-point-something, going all the way up to 57.0 with 100% application. So it's a balance in between the two, and it's a matter of fine-tuning it to where you want the balance from the brake bias going into specific corners that you need to figure out. So it's worth playing around with. Just remember that the ramping starts at 40% if you set it at 40%, and it starts wherever you set it. So you can set it at 60%, so you get the full it starts ramping and you're going towards 100%, and you get the full braking power of the higher end peak setting from the higher end percentage range. So anything below 60 is going to be that 56.0, and it's only going to start ramping at 60%. Alright, so let's talk about the ballast up here in the braking a little bit. The ballast, the lower you go with the ballast, the more understeer it is on entry in terms of balance and feel, and more oversteer on the exit of the corner. The higher you go to the on the ballast, the more oversteer it is on entry, with the more understeer on exit. So as a result, pretty much everyone has been running in a more positive range of the ballast, the maximum being 150. A lot of people will run 150 everywhere and just build the rest of the setup around it to find a comfortable range that they would like. They are limiting themselves relatively, but at the end of the day, with how the sim puts things together, running the higher end, you're not really going to lose that much. But I'm usually around 40 because it's not too much or too little of each of the effect, and the weight balance range usually around 48.8 to 49.0 is usually fairly comfortable. The technical side of this is, the balance is basically weight that is shifted from the car from either more forward or more rearward. So in real life, they basically have to move a big block of lead or something, just transfer the weight around. But in the sim, this is just a simple explanation of the feel of it. And once you experiment, you'll get a much better idea of how the changes, feel, and then you can adjust to what is good for you, and so on. Alright, so we've covered the rake and stuff a fair bit. Now it's time to move over to the dampers. So basically the front and the rear heave basically controls, the front heave controls the front heave balance on bump and rebound, and the rear is the same for the rear heave. So it's basically fine-tuning the aerodynamic balance to what you would like. So for example, you go up to 30 on the front heave, and as a result is giving you the turn off of the corner you want. However, on entry it's a bit understeery. You can then go down on the front heave bump, which makes it a little bit softer, and as a result gives you a little bit more downforce on entry. And exits, which is controlled by the rebound, in the front you control the aerodynamic balance there. So if you were to make the rebound softer, the front end would the front ride height will be higher in the air. The front end will be you'll allow the front end from a softer setting to move up into the air higher on throttle application. Talked about before with heaves, for example, on throttle application, where the back end is shifting down on the front end and shifting up a bit. So this kind of manages this a fair amount. The stiffer you make it, the less movement. The softer you make it, the more movement. And it's basically the same range with the heave rate setting, but think of the heave rate settings as big 1.0 changes, and the bump and rebound changes as point 1 something, maybe 0.2 something of a change. But aerodynamics being so important in this car, such a tiny change of 0.1 of something in the downforce level in a different area of the corner, you can feel it, and it makes a fairly big difference. So fine-tuning your aerodynamic balance with the heave settings will play a big role. You get in the ballpark settings of what you think you want, or what you want from information on the circuit, and then you fine-tune that balance on entry and exit with the front heave and the rear heave, bump and rebound. Alright, so with that said, the front and rear bump and rebound I suspect has more of mechanical involvement than the front and rear heave. The front and rear heave, because it's controlling the heave and the up and down movement of the car in the front and the rear, as a result, is nearly purely aerodynamic, because it's managing it in the different phases of the corner. To further elaborate on the bump and rebounds, I'll explain the front bump and the front rebound mainly first, but as I said, I suspect it has more of a mechanical link. So it does shift the balance in an aerodynamic way, but less significantly than the heave settings naturally. How changing the front and rear bump and rebound affects the mechanical side of the setup, basically your camber and stuff, and overall balance on entry and exit, I'm not 100% sure. But first let me explain the difference between the front and the rear. So basically, and I explained this going into a heavy braking zone. So for example, here at Road America, that'll probably be turn 5, that downhill braking zone. So the moment you get onto the brakes, the weight shifts forward on the car, so it's basically on the front bump. So the front end is dipping down, but the rear end is dipping up. So the rear end of the car is on the rebound on entry. So as I explained before when I was trying to hopefully successfully explain the heave rates, with the back end coming up and the front end dipping down, it creates the balance shifts where it's creating more downforce in the front and so on as well, and limiting the back end from going up on the rebound is basically going to make it stiffer, so that the back end isn't coming up as much, and as a result is stopping the back end from coming up more and creating more downforce in the front end. So on any deceleration, as touched on before, where the moment you get off the gas, it's shifting forward a little bit, so it's immediately on the bump and the rear, on the front bump and the rear rebound. The moment you start accelerating off of a corner, it's on the front rebound and the rear bump. So everything from the front is pretty much the opposite for the exit on the rear. So it's good to keep this in mind, because if you you missed the iRacing tooltip, that mentioned it being different, suspect it has, then you can fall into some issues where you go in the wrong direction in terms of balance. Alright, so to elaborate a little bit in terms of feel, you go lower on the bump, and the front and the rear heave in terms of feel and balance. When you soften up the front heave, you'll feel that change on initial entry to the corner. So let's say you go lower in the front bump. The moment you start turning into the corner, flicking it into the corner, some might say, you'll feel the change from the front heave because it's purely aerodynamic. If you made it softer, then you just added more downforce, because the front end is compressing more naturally. However, the front bump and rebound, the front bump I should say, is the second phase of entry. So when you're guiding the car to the apex, and when you make that softer, you feel the car rotate more initially going to the apex of the corner. And if you're having some understeer at this phase of the corner, then you know that your bump is probably just a little bit too high. The rebound as a result in the front and the rear here as well. The rebound in the front, I should say, the bump in the rear, is the first phase of exit. So basically just past the apex coming off of the corner, and as the front is on initial entry, the rear end is pretty much I guess second phase of exit, where you're really just coming off of the corner. You'll feel the aerodynamics starting to kick in on whatever you set your heave rate to be with your aerodynamic balance overall. So basically, first phase of entry, just flicking into the corner, front heave. Second phase of entry, front bump. First phase of exit, front rebound, and rear bump, and so on. Alright, so moving on to the drivetrain a bit, I'll do a quick touch on the gear ratios, but I'll try to explain the diff build to my understanding and the I guess the engine and car dials and stuff to the best of my ability. So basically, the gear ratios, your gearing, I mean, this is fundamental stuff when building your setup. You set the first gear for the slowest speed corner. That'll allow you to come off with the slowest speed corner for the specific track, that as safely as possible, I suppose. But you want to cut it close to the limit where you can modulate the gas a little bit, if you're very close to the limit, and get away with it. The seventh gear, the top gear, you want to set it to basically the high speed you are on the circuit, and for the race you might want to go up a click or two on it for the draft. So you want to take this into consideration. When you're building this up initially, you just set it to the top speed you're going to reach with whatever downforce level. And then the gearing in between, you can set a difference of what, 18 to 22, 23 kph. That's pretty standard. However, you do want to fine tune for different corners. So here at Road America, for example, only use the first gear in turn 5 and turn 6, and then second gear for turn 2 and turn 8, I think it is, the downhill, the left-hander. And as well as the corner after the back straight, I might use second, and so on as well. So, fine-tuning the different gearing for different corners plays a big role. It could mean the difference between a tenth or two in most places if it's not optimized. If you're upshifting and the rev range is like really low, you're losing speed from acceleration. So you can play tricks with the gearing, like having a few gears very close and then some further away, where you don't need it as much. So the higher end gearing, you might want it to be further away than the lower end gearing. But it's a tough compromise, and you want to fine-tune it specifically to the track and the sector that you know that you'll need to gain the most amount of time that you can take such risk. So, just a quick overview. First gear, the slow speed corner, seventh gear, the top speed, whatever, and the stuff in between, you just set it to specific corners to get through them as quickly as possible. Alright, so moving on to the diff build. So the difference between the diff build here and the diff in-car dials is that, this is just that in-car dials that you can adjust in the car, and the same for the engine dials. It's core settings, but you can adjust it in the car as well. However, The diff build stuff, once you set it up, you know, the real life equivalent is basically setting this in the garage, then affecting this with this, the in-car dials in itself. So to my knowledge, everything in the diff build is controls on the steer. So entry preload is on the steer on initial, well, overall. On entry, middle, and exit, there's just an overall setting. So it's like adding one click to entry everywhere. And entry is just, you know, increase the on the steer on entry itself. Middle, increase on the steer in the middle of the corner. Exit, you go up on it and it increases. Let's read iRacing's description first. Exit locking affects how much wheel force is produced, attempting to keep both sides of the differential locking together. During acceleration out of the corner, higher settings have more locking force, lower settings have less locking force. The more locking, the more oversteer. So there's a technical side to this, to the exit diff, where coming off of a corner and you know, the inside wheel is spinning or the outside wheel is spinning or something like that, and you would set the exit diff to either take care of that problem, as it describes. The higher the setting, the more oversteer. So by either reducing the locking or increasing it, you shift the balance of which wheel from the left or to the right rear is spinning more or less. So there's a balance there, but I won't go too much into that. But basically, you know, the basic description is basically more if it gives you more oversteer on initial exit, and the lower setting, it's you know, the more understeery. But basically, in this F1 car and within iRacing, the diff build is relatively important. If you removed all these diff settings and you went on track, the car would just feel terrible. So it's a big drivability factor with this that the real life guys work with, although their differential settings is probably much more complex and they have like a shit ton more. But for us, it's basically, this is what we have to work with: entry preload, entry, and middle, to get it as drivable and comfortable. Alright, so with that said, and a basic way you can start with this is 1-1-2 or 1-1-1 and 1, of course, on the exit diff. 2 is a decent range. Once you go 3+ on the exit diff, it starts getting a bit more oversteer and throttle application. But basically, the entry preload is important because it gives an overall balance to the car, you know, overall. So it's entry, middle, and exit, so it's always on throughout the circuit. So it's like that overall understeer that you get from the entry diff setting. Now you might say that, you know, making a setup more oversteer is always going to be faster, but as I mentioned, there's the drivability side of things where, you know, without it, the car would just be so twitchy and ridiculous that you just lose time just trying to keep it, you know, online, comfortable versus anything else. Alright, so 1-1-2 is a good place for most people to start with because it gives a decent balance everywhere, so you can work off of that as your base to the setup. But just remember, each one of these, you know, adds some understeer, so it's just a matter of what you prefer, and so on. Moving to the diff in-car dials, it's I think each one of these settings, as iRacing says here, default setting for the entry diff in-car dials. You can change the setting while on track. Entry locking affects how much force is produced, attempting to keep both sides of the differential locking together during deceleration into the corner. High settings have more locking force, lower settings have less locking force. The more locking force, the more understeer. So it increases this, as it says, it gives you some understeer while decelerating. And the middle says the more locking force, the more understeer while decelerating, the more oversteer while accelerating. So the higher you go on these in-car dials, the entry will have more understeer while decelerating, so every time you're braking and you're not on the throttle, it's in effect. The middle, it's understeer while decelerating and oversteer while accelerating. So you get back onto the gas, you know it's oversteering a little bit more. So if you're running 2 here, for example, it might logically make sense to go up on the middle diff just to minimize the exit understeer, the initial exit understeer from the middle. But you know, that's something to fiddle with. Every change you make in a setup is, you know, defines it as your setup. So it's basically how you approach all these different things and put it together versus somebody else who's the only difference they might have is just perspective, knowledge, or whatever. That they make different stuff work for them, It's just a matter of making things work for you. Alright, so the exit differential, it says in the sim the more locking force, the more oversteer, but the moment you go up on it, you'll feel understeer. So I think the tooltip may be wrong, or I may be wrong. So it's something worth playing with to get a feel for it, and so on. But in terms of usefulness for the in-car dials, usually you do so much work building your setup throughout the week. Once you start racing on the weekend, that you don't really need to use the in-car dials. However, in the draft, it'll give you some understeer. So if you build your setup more towards the oversteer side, you can increase some understeer or induce some understeer from the in-car differentials. So when you're in the draft behind somebody, you can just tick it down even more to make the car better in dirty air. But that's a strategy some people use, but it's still a bit iffy because it changes the balance, because you have to switch back the moment you're in clean air, and if you don't, you risk spinning the car from having too much oversteer going into the next corner or something. So it's something worth playing with. Again, it's all about your different approach to the same problems everyone's having. Moving to the engine in-car dials, the engine braking is from 1 to 5, and 5, the engine is doing a lot less work to slow the car down. 1 is doing the most work it can to slow the car down. So the less engine braking you use, it increases your braking zone just by a little bit. Basically, you have to do more work with the brakes to slow the car down just as much, because the engine is not helping you as much as it is with the maximum setting. But we usually just run 1 on the engine braking. It does most of the work. You can fiddle with it depending on what brake balance you prefer, but you can run 2, which is a good balance in between, and it's not too much or too little. The engine power, fuel mixture, and throttle shaping next. Engine power, fuel mixture, again, it's just 1 is the maximum engine power, 1 is the more potent or fuel mixture, and then you lean it out by going higher in the setting with a maximum 10. So if you're running close on fuel, they could turn this down. It'll slow you down immediately, of course, but it's pretty much a straightforward thing you use. The same with the engine power. You can turn it down to save fuel and help you out in a tough situation. The throttle shaping basically dictates your throttle application to torque ratio. Alright, so looking at the graphic, you can see that 0 to 100% with throttle shaping 1, which is more of an S-shaped, there is a quicker gap between let's say 35% to 65%. So the moment you start getting into the throttle, it's like a jump where the difference between the real difference between 40 and 60 is so sharp that you're basically going you can say you can skipping there, because you go up to 60% on the throttle. So it's a big jump, and as a result it's more aggressive on the torque, and as a result you can get more wheel spin with the lower end settings. However, with the higher end settings, you go to 4 and it's more linear, so your torque levels is exactly 1-to-1 with the throttle inputs you have in there. So it's good to start with 4, and then you can turn it down to be a bit more aggressive depending on how you like your power application on exit. So with 1, you get into the gas and it's quick on the power right away. Initially it's much more aggressive because of the S-curve, and with 4 it's much less aggressive, and because it's linear. So if you prefer to have the power kick on right away and then just modulate your throttle accordingly to keep it on track basically, then you can run 1 or 2. And if you're really aggressive on the throttle, and you just don't want it to have to modulate your throttle as much, then you can run 4, and as a result you can be more aggressive on the throttle throttle application coming out of most of these corners. But overall in the F1 car, you want to already be relatively aggressive on the throttle itself, because you don't ease into the throttle on this car. You cannot jump into it a bit because it can handle it no matter what. Alright, so to give an overview of a good process when building the setups, which will help you overall. So one of the first things you want to set, you're at a new circuit, you set up the gearing. you can just drive around the track relatively slowly with a base setup or whatever. As long as you have the downforce level sorted, you know this track you'll either run, maximum downforce, decent level, 0 wicker, or -10. Let's say Road America here, you'll need -10 because of the long straights and whatnot. You decide the downforce level. You go out on track. You set the initial gearing for the slowest speed corners, the top speed you'll reach. Then set like a default range within the rest of the gearing, so you have something to start with and work off with as well. The next thing you can do is set the torsion bar rate level, because as talked about before, the low end settings is more oversteer on entry and exit with understeer in the middle of the corner. The higher end setting is understeer on entry and exit, but oversteer in the middle of the corner. So you can find a balance in between, because the higher you go, it's more of the other thing and less of the other, or whatever. And you can find a balance where the entry, middle, and exit for the specific track is comfortable, and it's comfortable to what you need to do, or what you need and what you want for the circuit itself. Once you set the torsion bar rate to a comfortable level, you can then look at the information for what the tire temperatures is giving you to then change the tire pressures, as well as the camber levels to the levels you want in temperature difference in the contact patch. You can increase it or decrease it to whatever you prefer. After this, because you set your torsion bar rate and your camber levels, you want to start focusing on the aerodynamics a little bit. You know what the heave rates do, you know what the anti-roll bar does, and you've probably experimented and gotten a feel for it. So if experimented and gotten a feel for it, where you know what does where and what you need where and so on, so you fiddle around and find the balance you prefer, that'll work well with your torsion bar rate, and then you've further fine-tuned the aerodynamic balance of which end of the car you want to work most aerodynamically. Do you want the back end to be moving up and down the most to give you the aerodynamic balance you want, or do you want the front end to be doing most of the work within how the heave rates works? This changes the aerodynamics, but you set the rake levels to a comfortable range where it's not too oversteery on entry and exit, and not too understeery as well, and just find a comfortable range with most of these things to start with. Then you start adjusting more towards speed and being a bit more aggressive overall. So as talked about the dampers and everything before, it's the front and rear heave is fine-tuning the aerodynamic balance. So you would have selected the front and the rear heave that you find is a good start, in the ballpark of what you want. You fine-tune that balance with the front and rear heave settings. And then the same with the front and rear rebound, you kind of fine-tune that balance overall as well. But because of its mechanical link, you would probably use it to fine-tune the balance of the car overall on initial entry to the apex and initial exit off of the corner, coming right off the corner from the apex itself. So you set the bump and rebounds for this entry and exit according to what you feel is necessary for the track, and to try and get as much turn and stuff as possible as well. Alright, so at the same time, you'll then want to figure out the ballast setting that is comfortable for the track as well. As you know, the ballast, the higher you go, the more oversteer it is on entry with understeer on exit. The lower you go, the more understeer it is on entry with more oversteer on exit. So you find a good balance where it's not giving you too much of the other to fully unbalance the car, and just find a comfortable range. And then you can fine-tune the balance on the rest of the car to whatever you prefer. So it's all about balance and putting everything together, and making it work to the best of your ability as a driver, and at the same time getting the most out of the car with whatever expertise you gain from experimentation and so on, technically, to get around the circuit as quickly as possible. Alright, so this has been a rough overview of the setup. I mean, this took me a while to put together, so it got frustrating a bit through there, but hopefully the information helps. I know I haven't explained it in a fully streamlined way, but any of you who are looking at this video in the first place are people who's going to have like a initial rudimentary knowledge, and my information is going to help at least. It's not going to hurt you in any way whatsoever. although I am lacking in technical knowledge in a lot of areas, the way I put things together has been useful to me for a while. So it's just a matter of you getting up to my level, then surpassing me with knowledge and experience, and adding to the stuff that is already mentioned here for you to go faster and so on as well. So hopefully it's been useful. And in the future I'll be posting another guide, but this one is going to be assuming that you know everything about the setup, but all you need to know is how to put everything together and fine-tune the setup and the balance and so on. So it's just going to elaborate more on the different things in the setup to get more speed out of it. So a lot of people know everything the setup does, but they don't know how to put it together to get the ultimate